Good evening. My name is Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight to this In Conversation, which is, we aim to bring you the very best, and I think we're certainly doing that tonight with two of the most significant figures in international diplomacy and statecraft of the last quarter century. Secretary Condoleezza Rice requires, neither of our guests tonight require any introduction. Of course, she was, of course, the 66th US Secretary of State and 20th National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. Alexander Downer, of course, longest serving Australian Foreign Minister in history of his country, then High Commissioner in London, and now someone we're proud to have as Chairman of our Board of Trustees here at Policy Exchange. They're going to conduct an in conversation on the great issues of the day, particularly around America's and other alliances, and obviously of great relevance to the United Kingdom at this juncture in time. They're going to talk for 25 minutes, and then we're going to open to questions. Usual Policy Exchange house rules, no question too outrageous. You simply have to state your name and organization first. So if you could please stick up your electronic hands and give us as much advance notice so you can have a sense who wants to ask a question. So Alexander, always a pleasure to have you here. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thanks, Dean and Condi. It's a huge pleasure to catch up with you again. It's always a huge pleasure to catch up with you, and we had very happy times together when we were both the respective foreign ministers of our countries. So in those days, we spent a lot of time focusing on the Middle East, of course, and I want to come back to Afghanistan a bit later, but I want to start off by talking to you about the most important geopolitical issue in the world today. That's the rise of China and how we manage the rise of China. We dealt with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao as presidents of China, but now, you know, we have a new president, or a different president of China, with Xi Jinping. And do you think that China has gone into a completely new phase of policy? I mean, that's true, I think, myself, of domestic policy, but of foreign policy. What do you think they're trying to achieve? And I suppose, importantly, how do you think we, the United States, of course, in particular, but the UK, Australia, how should we respond to this?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you too, Alexander. We had wonderful times together. Even in the most difficult times, you were just a terrific foreign minister and a great ally. And thanks to Policy Exchange for this opportunity. China. Well, I've often said now it's not a rising China any longer. It's a risen China. It is a China that is now making its place on the world stage. If I go back just a little bit, I think that we all had expectations of the integration of China into the international system, a belief that you couldn't leave 1.4 billion creative and energetic people with a growing economy outside of the international system. But there were certain expectations that China, having acceded to the WTO early, would conform its economic practices to WTO standards. That China would be a net contributor to international stability. And I think what you're seeing now is a kind of frustration that most of that didn't materialize, that instead we have a China that takes advantage of its position in the international economy, theft of intellectual property, cybersecurity attacks, concerns about Chinese industrial policy, and of course, in the context of a China that is very assertive militarily and politically internationally, whether it is simply tearing up the agreement in 1997 of one country, two systems in Hong Kong. Hong Kong really is becoming, unfortunately, a province of China. Whether it is the activity in the South China Sea or more recently, the aggressive behavior toward Taiwan, this is a China that you and I didn't deal with in quite the same way. And one of the big questions is it really Xi Jinping? Or is this just the maturation of a China that is no longer, to quote their former leaders, hiding and biting, but now ready to be assertive? I happen to think some of it is Xi Jinping. I think that this is a leader who has outsized ambitions personally, to the point that he has also torn up the script about collective leadership, torn up the script about limits on term limits, which used to be 2 terms, and an age limit. Somebody who at home now has school children reciting the thoughts of Xi Jinping, and who seems to want to see himself in the pantheon as one of the great Chinese leaders, right there after Mao. And if that is the case, then we're also dealing with not just national ambitions, but leadership ambitions that I think could be actually quite complicated. So when I try to answer how do we respond, it too is complicated. There are areas where we simply have to confront. Freedom of navigation, issues around Taiwan. I was glad to see the administration let it be known that we've been doing training with the Taiwanese military. I think we have to be sure that we are taking care of our own supply chain issues, that we are taking care, for instance, of the semiconductor vulnerabilities that we all have, that we're doing more to support innovation in frontier technologies like AI and quantum computing. Those are things we can do. And perhaps the most important thing to do, that we can do, and why I'm glad we have this opportunity, China doesn't have allies. It's got clients. We have allies. We have strong allies in the Asia Pacific, Japan and Korea, Australia, many states of Southeast Asia, a friend in India. And we have European allies, particularly like Great Britain, that, by the way, I still consider a special relationship. We can, as an alliance of free nations who want to see an open Indo-Pacific, we can make a difference in conditioning the environment in which that more aggressive China acts.
So very recently, there has been the announcement by the Biden administration with Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson of AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States arrangement. There's a sort of focus on nuclear submarines for Australia, but it's an agreement which means much more than that. It's about those 3 countries sharing advanced technology, including artificial intelligence, cyber technology and the like, which, I mean, personally, I think is hugely important, because I think that AUKUS will contribute to a better power balance in the Indo-Pacific. And if you have a better power balance in the Indo-Pacific, it's not to contain China, but it's to constrain China. You will have a more peaceful region. I think what's interesting for me as a former Australian foreign minister is the way the UK has decided to change direction, if you like, to use a phrase they use in the UK, tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And that came through in the policy paper they produced called the Integrated Review. And then it's been manifest in the AUKUS agreement. So I think what is interesting is the way the UK has decided that it will once more become a real player in the Indo-Pacific. And personally, I welcome that, and I guess you do as well.
Oh, absolutely. I welcome it because, first of all, it's a terrific grouping of 3 when you think about it. I love the idea of the Quad. I think that the Chinese don't particularly, they were actually unnerved by the notion of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. I think they will be equally unnerved by Australia, Great Britain, and the United States, because there you bring real weight militarily, technologically, in terms of intelligence. The UK is really quite a powerhouse in those areas, whether it's military technology or intelligence. I can tell you that when it came from British intelligence, you had a tendency to stand up and take notice. And so those assets now brought into the Indo-Pacific with an alliance that is also, of course, an alliance of values, not just of interests, I think has the potential to really shape the Indo-Pacific, along with Japan and Korea and India, in ways that make it difficult for China to reach some of its ambitions. And so I'm very much a supporter of AUKUS. I'm glad that I'm hoping that it really doesn't just find footing, but that it reaches its full potential, which I think is significant.
And when it comes to the Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, we were together with Taro Aso, the then Foreign Minister of Japan, at the very first trilateral strategic dialogue meeting, which I think was in Sydney. I have a photograph of the three of us standing on, I was going to say by Sydney Harbour, looking over the harbour. We weren't good enough to stand on it, but just by it. So it's amazing how it has evolved into what it has evolved. But it seems to me you've got two things happening here. You've got a more outward-looking Great Britain, a country that has decided that it's going to play more of a global role. And for the United States and Australia, that's hugely welcome. But there's another way of looking at this, and that is that Chinese foreign policy has been so unsuccessful that it has led these traditional allies to rally together in ways that we haven't seen for quite some time.
I think that's absolutely right. In fact, I have often cautioned us, the United States, because we can be a bit this way, let's not talk loudly about loyalty test. You have to declare that you are against this and with us on that, because it just, particularly as you know, Alexander, for instance, within India, that's a losing strategy. But what we're seeing here is a natural coming together of countries that have similar interests and have definitely similar values to counter a Chinese foreign policy that is simply overly aggressive. The way that China dealt with Australia had to cause a backlash there. I don't really know what they thought they were doing. Who decides to stir up trouble on the Sino-Indian border that's been quiet for 40 years? The Chinese decided to do that. And you can go on and on and on. And I wonder if at some point it's not going to cause a backlash in China, because what you're getting is a kind of balancing against China that perhaps they really didn't expect. And oh, by the way, it's even having an effect on some of their enterprises. So Huawei, which was supposed to be China's telecommunications international giant, is actually finding it very difficult now, but really through a campaign that was successfully led by the United States, to be a 5G player in a lot of places because people don't trust them. And so I do think China has made a lot of its own problems. We sometimes engage in what I'll call authoritarian envy. Oh, they're so wise. The Chinese have such a long time horizon. They're so good. Why can't we build airports like that? You've heard all of this. Well, actually, sometimes authoritarians make really bad policy. And when there's only one person in Xi Jinping who really matters, they have a single point of failure. And they make big mistakes. I just point to, the one-child policy, which was supposed to take care of population control, was efficiently carried out, even brutally carried out. And now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. And they're trying now to have 2 children or 3 children. So when we engage in this democracy is messy and we can't seem to get anything done, remember that when authoritarians make mistakes, they make big mistakes because there's nobody to check the ruler. And so I do think the Chinese have set this up. It doesn't mean that the threat is subsiding, because one could say that they will have to double down on this strategy. But I think we're getting into a better position to resist what they are doing.
Well, their wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's sometimes called too, it strikes me as just being a huge mistake. And the trouble with a country like that is that there's no public debate about the government. I mean, President Biden is subject to a fusillade of criticism every day, as is Boris Johnson, and in Australia, Scott Morrison, and everything these leaders do and their governments do is debated and considered. But in China, there's no debate. And I'd have to say, I think they've run one of the worst foreign policies that I've ever seen by any country in the last 3 or 4 years by alienating what you might broadly describe as the West or the liberal democratic world, and leading them to rally to balance China's power. I mean, it's not really in the interests of the Chinese people for the government to have led the rest of the world to rally against them. And, you know, we don't have time to talk about it, but their domestic economic policy, that's not really thought through very well either. So this sort of concept that somehow China is a country brilliantly run by marvelous technocrats and this is an alternative political system to our political systems, and you know the rest of the world should consider this. Well, I think that has been exposed as complete nonsense by the very poor performance of the Xi Jinping government over the last few years.
Well, and also I think that the internal policies are also starting to emerge in really kind of interesting ways. For instance, you know, authoritarians can't stand to have alternative sources of power. And so these great private companies that, you know, the Alibabas of the world, all of a sudden Jack Ma wants to spend more time with his family. And so you are, you know, they're putting party members on these boards. The investments are being, having to be done along with the Belt and Road. It's really quite confusing. But I always say, don't underestimate your opponent and don't overestimate them. If we do what we should be doing in terms of our allies, in terms of our own infrastructure, we will be able to meet this challenge, but it's not yet met. And so continued attention to this and continued work together as allies. And again, I can't be happier to see Britain as a part of this, because I think Britain brings real weight to this alliance.
So this game is not over. We've got more work to do. So that brings me to the issue of Taiwan. Beijing has been doing a lot of saber rattling in recent, well, the last couple of years, but certainly in recent months, in recent weeks. Do you think the United States policy, which was the policy in your time, of course, as it was the policy of your predecessors, and it is still now, of strategic ambiguity in relation to Taiwan, do you think it's seen its day and it might be time to be more definite and for us allies to say, we will defend Taiwan if it is militarily attacked?
I'm one who believes in action rather than words in this case. I'll use an example that our friends in Britain would be very familiar with. You know, we didn't depend actually on rhetoric about Article 5, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. We depended on having American forces deploy in Europe that said to the Russians, to the Soviets, if you cross this, you will have to kill an American, and that means the President of the United States will jump down your throat. That's how it wasn't just the words.
Yeah.
So I really care less what we say about strategic ambiguity or the like. What we have to make very clear to the Chinese is there would be costs for invasion of or military action against Taiwan. Now, I actually think that it doesn't matter whether you and I think the United States will defend Taiwan. What matters is, does Xi Jinping believe the United States will defend Taiwan? Of course. And I would say that there's enough ambiguity in their minds at this point that I wouldn't expect an amphibious landing against Taiwan. For one thing, we have trained, particularly over the last 20 years or so, the Taiwanese armed forces can't defeat the Chinese, but they can exact a price. And so to the degree that we keep arming them and keep training them, I think we're contributing to the deterrent factor. Now, what worries me is that the Chinese will take a page out of the Putin playbook for Ukraine. So it won't be, and I don't mean Crimea here, I mean Eastern Ukraine. It won't be a kind of all-out assault. It will be paramilitary forces that kind of penetrate the country, or in the case of Taiwan, the use of social media to sow discord. Maybe the cutting of a few underwater cables. Taiwan, after all, is an island country. You might get, of course, the problems with cybersecurity. You know, there was a fist fight in the Taiwanese parliament a few weeks ago, and I kind of wondered to myself, that really happened between the people of Taiwan, or was that something that was provoked from the outside? So I could imagine instead just making trouble in Taiwan, making it hard to govern, trying then to strengthen pro-Beijing forces within Taiwan. Now, the good news is every time the Chinese have played this game and tried to strengthen pro-Beijing forces, it's backfired. And they've done just the opposite, because the Taiwanese people are very proud of their democracy and they're suspicious of Beijing. But look for Chinese activities that are more nuanced and smarter than just some kind of amphibious assault. I don't think they'll do that, but they could make a lot of trouble for Taiwan. And the problem there is you never cross a threshold at which the United States has to respond.
Yes, that's also my theory. I think that is how they would be planning to manage the Taiwan issue. You know, cyber attacks, internal dissent, sowing seeds of malcontent, just creating trouble. It doesn't seem to me very likely that they'd mount a D-Day landing kind of an exercise, because, I mean, that would trigger the United States and its allies to respond militarily. So there may be a lot of things. They may be a bad government, the government of Xi Jinping, but they're not suicidal, and that would be Armageddon in the Asia Pacific. So I guess they don't want that. I want to bring you back though a bit more towards the UK, but not that far, back to Afghanistan, and the decision by, actually originally President Trump announced that he wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan and started this negotiation with the Taliban, or had these negotiations with the Taliban, followed by President Biden after the election, in the end choosing a day and just leaving on that day. I think, you know, I wouldn't have said this if I were the Foreign Minister of Australia, but now I'm not. I think I can say it. I was a bit alarmed by this, because it seemed that the United States was losing the will to be the great leader and champion of liberal democracy and its values in the world, that it was withdrawing more into itself. And of course that makes us in the rest of the world, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but in Europe as well, because of the threat as they would see it in Europe of Russia, it makes us all a bit uneasy about the degree of will that the United States has. Do you think that is an unfair interpretation of what has happened in terms of, I mean, I'll be bipartisan in my criticism. I think that Trump, as well as the Biden administration, in the way they've handled Afghanistan.
I would have to agree with you. And look, I think it's been happening for a while in the United States. I think it actually even goes back to the Obama administration, that the sense that we've carried too many burdens, it's time to pull in some. If you read Barack Obama's last interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, it sounds a bit like sophisticated Donald Trump. You know, these are lies, they're just freeloaders. They got me into that crazy war in Libya, and then they couldn't even supply themselves. I mean, this attitude in the United States about our extended leadership that we've had to do for 70 years, I think that's been going on for a while. And it takes different manifestations. It looks one way under Obama, it looks a different way under Trump, and then it looks differently under Biden. I was saddened by Afghanistan in particular, because I think we allowed the wrong narrative to develop around Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan because there was a terrorist threat there. We knew that if we could clean out Al-Qaeda's safe haven there, the possibilities of attacks against the United States and the rest of us, the rest of our friends and allies, would be lessened. And we did it the way that we have carried out our security for years, by forward deployment of our forces to where the trouble was. And that forward deployment brought with it intelligence assets, military capabilities, allies that actually were benefiting us in staying safe at home and keeping our allies home. Our longest war was not Afghanistan. Our longest war is still Korea. We are in an armistice in Korea. We didn't win that war, but we didn't lose it. And as a result, we still have 28,000 American forces in Korea because we don't think even the sophisticated South Korean army can hold off the crazy man to the north. And so would we say that that hasn't worked for peace and security and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula? No, it's worked. And that's how we should have thought about Afghanistan. And so when we gave up, for instance, Bagram Airfield, an air base, a sophisticated air base in a country that has a 900-kilometer border with Iran, what about the strategic asset that would have been? And so it became this longest war. We've got to get out. It's been 20 years. Let's do it on the anniversary of 9/11. I never understood that.
All the wrong symbolism, that.
All the wrong symbolism. But we did decide to do it. I think the president has wanted to do it ever since he was overruled by President Obama in 2009. He was not in favor of more forces to fight the Taliban. And even if you decided that, okay, it's time to get out, which as I've just said, I didn't think it was time to get out. And I should just note, if we left 2,500, 3,000 soldiers, we're going to be another 7,000 or 8,000 NATO forces there. So we were talking about a significant residual force to help the Afghans. I also think the piece that we missed was, yes, it was good to do things for the Afghan people and Afghan women and so forth. But when you have failed states that aren't stable, they are dangerous. And that's why we wanted to build in Afghanistan. So all of that said, even if we decided to get out, why we decided to get out at the beginning of the fighting season, as opposed to when the Taliban goes into their caves in January, I don't understand. I worry that the pictures look like an American retreat. I worry that credibility is not divisible. And so China will read into that. Russia will read into it. So we've got some work to do to reestablish the sense that America intends to continue to play a major role in the world. And it means, Alexander, we've got some work to do at home too. I mean, there's a reason that Americans are not as confident as they once were. It has to do with our own problems with people who were just left out of globalization and have been susceptible to populist messages. So we have some work to do on our own, but I sincerely hope that you're not seeing the nadir, that you're seeing the nadir and that we'll start to move up in terms of America's willingness in the world. I used to tease you, Alexander, and a lot of my friends by saying the only thing people hate more than unilateral American leadership is no American leadership. Yes, and so maybe we'll get back to doing something these days.
Yeah, well, we used to feel so comfortable with it, I guess, and I think taking up your point, we feel rather uncomfortable with it beginning or seeming to diminish. But I mean, the one point I would make is that after the I don't mind saying it, the debacle of Afghanistan, AUKUS was announced out of nowhere. And that sense of the family of those three countries coming together and the UK getting back into the Indo-Pacific and getting back into the dealing with global problems, that was very encouraging.
It was enormously important that it came at that time. Now, a little bit of an own goal with the French, but nonetheless, it was really important to do.
Thank you to from the floor. First one I see coming up is from Dr. Julian Lewis, MP, chairman of the Joint Parliamentary Intelligence Committee. Julian, are you coming in, or do you want me to read the question? And then, so Dr. Julian Lewis has the question asking to both panelists, what level of security guarantee could AUKUS offer Taiwan, given that its independence from the People's Republic of China has never been recognized? Secretary Rice.
Yes, as I suggested earlier, I think that the Taiwan Relations Act, which the United States acts under, is very clear that we have to help Taiwan defend itself. And I think that's the way to say it. If you say we will defend Taiwan, you start to perhaps change the terms of what has been a fairly stable understanding that neither side should change the status quo. We all continue to recognize the People's Republic of China, not Taiwan, as a separate country. But I think that there are other things that we could do in addition to continuing to train the Taiwanese armed forces, to arm the Taiwanese armed forces, to share intelligence about what may be going on both inside Taiwan with Chinese efforts to destabilize the country. I think that's the way to do it, but I would not do it through declarations. I would just mention one other thing. We need to continue to push to have Taiwan have more space in the international system, inviting Taiwan to health conferences, inviting Taiwan to economic conferences. The Asia Pacific Economic Conference Council actually does invite Taiwan to those meetings. The Chinese are unhappy about it, but they show up. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do to bolster Taiwan. And I am one who believes that it's time to revisit the contacts policy for all of us. I think we ought to start receiving Taiwanese officials.
Thank you. Alexander.
Look, I don't have a lot to add to that. I agree. I mean, I think in relation to Taiwan, we have to leave a message with China that if they can continue to try to change the status quo through the use of force, that will have devastating consequences for China, so they shouldn't even think about it. And AUKUS has been, I mean, symbolically, and we'll see how it plays out in practice, but I think it will play out well in practice, given the Five Eyes relationship has worked so incredibly well, particularly between the United States, the UK and Australia for decades. I think AUKUS will make a really major contribution to the power balance in the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore to the peace of the Indo-Pacific region. And it will remind people in Beijing, when they stop and think, that the more they do try to change the status quo through the use of force, the more they will draw great and substantial powers together to resist that. So their best interests will always be served by cooperation and collaboration with the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Japan, and so on. So the list goes on. They will not be served by trying to bypass us, break international law, and behave in a way that will outrage us.
Thank you. And now a question from Sir David Manning. Sir David, can you hear me? Can we hear you? Sir David. Not here. We'll come back to him in a second.
He's muted.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you loud and clear, Sir David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. And can I just, my question is to Condi, but first to say how nice it is to see her and how nice it is, as always, to hear her. And I'm going to push my luck and ask if she would comment on two things. One is to say more about the state of the United States itself. Alexander was talking about the shock of Afghanistan. I think we all know that the Trump years with America First and the strains in the alliance were a shock, and that we have now had Afghanistan. How resilient do you think American democracy is, Condi? And what lessons should the alliance draw from recent experiences? And the second thing is to ask you whether you think we've lost sight of Russia a bit because of our focus on China. And of course, there's every reason to focus on China. But if you were back in your old job as Secretary of State, what would you do at this point to try and contain Russia, perhaps to try and entice Russia into a more responsible behavior, when certainly those of us in Europe feel that Russia is doing what it can to destabilize our alliances here?
Absolutely. Well, David, wonderful to hear you too. I mean, another great friend and alive from those years. We went through some crucible times together. On Russia, I am concerned. You know, it's not as if Russia has the assets that China has. You know, the Russian economy is basically a resource-intensive economy, and they don't have the economic weight of China or so on. But they are still a military power to be reckoned with. And I was just saying to somebody yesterday about Latin America, the Russians are sustaining Maduro in Venezuela. What are they doing in our hemisphere? Not to mention the cybersecurity threat that they pose and the continued efforts to try to use social media for destabilization. And so, yes, and we have to keep our eye on what they're doing in Ukraine. So yes, I think we shouldn't lose sight of Russia. One of the things that I think will empower the most, you know, I'm a believer in climate change. I'm a believer that we have to do something about it. But to the degree that we still have to be dependent on hydrocarbons, when we decide that we are going to destroy the North American platform between Canada and Mexico for the production of hydrocarbons, natural gas and oil, we empower the Russians and their ability to use high oil prices to carry out their diplomacy. And so we have to be very careful about the way that we think about energy policy. You know the story of the Germans and the pipelines. Putin was yesterday saying the way to ease the energy shortages in Europe is to remember Russia and the pipelines. Putin loves to play the energy card. We need a smart energy policy. We need an environmentally sustainable energy policy, but we also need one that doesn't prematurely empower the Russians and the Iranians in this regard. David, as to America itself, look, I will tell you that there have been times when I've been very worried about our country. I think we are a bit at each other's throats these days. We seem to be rewriting our history in the worst possible ways so that our kids are kind of being told not to respect and love their country. That bothers me a great deal. But I am very much a believer that American democracy is strong. You know, a lot of my friends on January 6th were very unnerved by what they saw at our Capitol. I was personally unnerved. But that night, when our senators and congresspeople went back into the Capitol after it was secured, and in the most boring way possible, certified the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I thought, you know, the founding fathers gave us pretty good institutions and they worked. As I went around the world, I would say to people, get your institutions right and specific personalities will matter less. And I think we saw that on that day. I want to make sure that we as Americans are paying attention to the things that have caused populism to rise in the United States, an educational system that is still not serving the poorest of our kids, for instance, people in parts of our country who have no skills for the modern economy. We've got to pay attention to that and do something about that. But I continue to be confident in American resilience. And I continue to be confident that even though Americans may be tired of international leadership, they also don't like what they see when we don't lead. And so an American president can still mobilize the American people to do good in the world. I really do believe that.
Thank you. And two more questions. I think we've got time for that just about. First, if I can just read it out from Roger Orff, distinguished American living London trustee of Policy Exchange, asking you to say a little bit more on the character and implications of the US departure from Afghanistan. If I can just interpolate and extrapolate for Roger's question, for example, the impact on radicalization across the region and the wider world, the implications perhaps also for US relations with Pakistan. Just a question from me as well, whether there's a case for a reset of that. And I know you've talked about relations with Pakistan in some of your commentary post the US departure from Afghanistan. Just be grateful for some more of your thoughts on that.
Yes, certainly. I'm worried about radicalization, both kind of physical radicalization, in that you will, when you allow 5,000 prisoners who were there for good reason to be released into a country as unstable as Afghanistan, they're going to make trouble. ISIS-K is going to make trouble. I know people say, well, maybe the Taliban has changed. Maybe the ones who were kind of hanging out in Doha want to be recognized, but there are those ones who were fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan that have to be dealt with as well. And I think you will see a radicalized Taliban. We used to say that we wanted to make sure, after Al-Qaeda carried out the 9/11 attacks, that it wasn't profitable either psychologically or politically or from a rock star point of view to be a terrorist. We were going to make it look really ugly to be a terrorist. Well, now it's a little bit more, you can be a rock star again. You have a country again. I think we have to be very careful that we haven't empowered a terrorist state in Afghanistan to attract others to it and to become a problem for us in terms of our own security. And of course, we no longer have intelligence assets on the ground. We don't have military assets on the ground. So I think it's going to be quite shaky. And the questioner is right to raise Pakistan, a country which we could never quite convince at least elements of the Pakistani leadership, particularly ISI, we could never quite convince them that a stable Afghanistan was in Pakistan's interest. So instead, they did business with the Haqqani network. They did business with some of the most radical elements. I will tell you now a little vignette that just says this. I never canceled, only once canceled a trip when somebody threatened me. I went into Lebanon, into that airport when Hezbollah said they were going to blow up my airplane, because I said they won't do that to the Secretary of State. So I didn't cancel easily. But I did cancel when I saw my itinerary to Pakistan on an Al-Qaeda website. That is a government that is thoroughly infiltrated by extremism, and it's a problem to have left Afghanistan and the close contacts that it gave us to be able to moderate Pakistani behavior as well. So yes, I'm very concerned about the radicalization of the region.
Thank you. And question from Admiral Lord West, former First Sea Lord and Security Minister. Lord West, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much indeed. And the question is for both the panelists. I have to say, first of all, my second part of my question was to do with the relationship with Pakistan, because the ISI's actions, I think, have been so appalling, and it does relate to India, and that in a way raises the next thing, which is, would there be merit, do you think, in the United Kingdom joining the Quad? And because I believe there would be, but do you think it would actually be allowed to? Do you think the other nations would like it to join? And that's the question.
Senator, do you want to go from the Australian point of view on this one?
So we Australians feel incredibly close to the UK. I've often said that there is, in my experience as a foreign minister of nearly 12 years, I don't think there is any country in the world with which we have more of an identity of views than the UK, or the UK and the US. So, I mean, in principle, it would be really quite something for the UK to join the Quad. But I think it's down the track. I don't think it's something that's likely to happen very soon, because I think the Quad, which has been developing incredibly well, I think it needs to settle down, get its own sort of character and rhythm, and as it builds, then I think adding one or two other countries to it could make sense. So I think in time the UK could come into the Quad, but I don't think that's going to happen in the immediate future. I think it's going to be just confined to trying to get the relationship between those four countries in the context of Indo-Pacific security bedded down.
I would agree with that. I think that The Quad, it also has at this point work to do, I think, in terms of really figuring out how much India will be willing to do within what looks like an alliance structure, but that isn't really an alliance. And not to mention Japan in that regard. And I think if the Quad thinks of itself as an open architecture, where the ability to share with other like-minded countries and other like-minded alliances is possible on any given circumstance, on any given, for instance, freedom of navigation exercises or intelligence sharing, that may be the way to think about it. It's a kind of, it isn't a fixed alliance in the way that NATO has been a fixed alliance. It's a grouping of countries that will work very closely together, but will from time to time be open to cooperation and coordination with other countries, including with AUKUS, which will have two of the members in it. And so I think there are ways to promote the kind of cooperation that we need without disrupting at this particular point in time the Quad's development.
Lord West, did you want to come back on that at all? Can't hear you. We'll move on to the next question.
I think I understand that view, and it was sort of feeling that I had about it, I have to say. It was just, I thought it was a way of really showing China, as we're beginning to show with the AUKUS agreement and other things, that the fact that actually, if they behave in the way they're behaving, then a whole group and raft of nations will suddenly become involved in countering them, and that this is a very good message to get them. But I quite understand what's been said about the Quad.
Since you are an admiral, it is worth making this point, that I do think the Royal Navy could from time to time participate in Quad military exercises, and there have been, I'm not sure how many, but there have been 2 or 3 Quad naval exercises. So I think that is, I think actually, by the way, the participation of the Royal Navy in those sort of exercises would be very welcome.
I agree. I think that that's the place to start, is that you have specific activities in which you get this kind of coordination and cooperation. And I think that will send the same message to the Chinese. They've got to be reeling a little bit that you have the Quad and now you have AUKUS. I think we're sending the right message.
Final question, Harry James, student, Oundle School. Can you hear me, Harry James? Are you muted? Can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you. I can see you've kindly submitted your question, so I'll ask it, if I may, on your behalf, whether China's aggressive foreign policy in Africa, including its Belt and Road Initiative, could lead to potential confrontations between countries there, the West, AUKUS, and China. How great do you see the danger of conflict in Africa?
Well, I think the danger of conflict in Africa comes more from some unresolved issues in Africa. If you look at, for instance, what's going on in Ethiopia, I think we've got some unresolved conflicts in Africa that need to be resolved in their own right. I do think that Belt and Road is problematic in a different way than just conflict, which is that we've all spent Britain, the United States, Japan, India, Australia, all of us who are donors to Africa, talking a lot about corruption and the need to fight it, and the need to have democratization of those regimes, no presidents for life. Many of us have conditioned our assistance on those notions, on those principles. And then you get China that comes in and says, no conditions whatsoever. We'll build an AU, an African Union, Taj Mahal in Addis, and we won't ask any questions. And I'm more concerned that it will arrest the development of Africa in that way, because it will reward bad practices by African leaders. But the funny thing is happening in Africa as well, which is that this idea that they were going to loan to own, in other words, they were going to lend countries money for ports and the like that they then couldn't pay back. The Chinese would own the ports. Well, that doesn't play so well in the 21st century. And African leaders are pushing back. They're pushing back on unsafe employment practices, unsafe labor practices, environmental practices. And what we need to do is to expose what Belt and Road is really doing in these developing countries. And I think we've got some allies in these African countries that don't like being treated like this is just another phase of now new colonialism by China. And so I think we've got some things we can do. One thing we did at the Hoover Institution, where I'm the director, is we actually had a number of African civil society and journalists to Hoover. It was remote because of COVID, but we talked a lot about what is happening. Then they can go and inform their own countries about what is going on. So there are good ways to push back against Belt and Road, and trying to get the development of Africa to be on terms that are good for the African people, not for the Chinese, I think that's a battle I think we can win.
Alexander, final thought.
Yeah, well, so my final thought is that you wouldn't want to overestimate how popular China is in Africa. When I was in Africa in late 2019, I was struck by the degree of resentment there was against the way they built infrastructure projects. Yes, the infrastructure projects were welcome, but the Chinese brought in their own labor. They didn't use local labor. You know, money was lent, and so there is a question about the repayment terms. And I think more broadly, the way they have been indebting countries, not just, by the way, in Africa, but including in Africa, is problematic. So I'm not sure that their sort of contribution to the development task is either necessarily such good development, and secondly, as welcome as we might imagine. And the other thing with the Belt and Road Initiative is that the amount of money that was originally offered was never achievable, and it's shrunk to a fraction of what it originally was. And I think many countries are becoming very suspicious that Belt and Road is much more about projecting Chinese power and influence and not much about development. So I think there is much more skepticism and cynicism about it than we might, on the face of it, imagine.
Thank you, Alexander. Just want to thank both our panelists. Been a fantastic audience as well. Great evening in the life of Policy Exchange. Great morning there, of course, in California. It's one of the great things of the Zoom era is we can match these things up in the right place, right time. It's been an outstanding occasion. I know you'll wish me to express your collective thanks to our two guest speakers and look forward to welcoming you back here very soon. Thank you.